Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Claire Shearer, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Naval Children's Charity. I'd like to welcome you all here today. We're delighted to have so many of you joining us from across the UK and indeed globally. Firstly, a bit of housekeeping, if I could. Could you please use the Q&A to ask questions for the panel discussion? Please put them in just during the presentation. Use the chat box to network with other attendees, and please keep your use of language professional and polite. Thank you so much. The Naval Children's Charity, formerly known as the Royal Navy and Royal Marines Children's Fund, provides financial and holistic support to the children and young people up to the age of 25 of both serving and veteran personnel from the Royal Navy. We started as orphanages in 1825, and we now provide direct support to well over 2,000 children each year, as well as providing resources and working with other organisations to ensure that our children get the help and support they need. In 2009, we produced a piece of research, the Overlooked Casualties of Conflict Report, which identified the 10 key challenges that service children experience because of being in a military family. In 2020, the Naval Children's Charity commissioned the Veterans and Families Institute for Military Social Research at Anglia Ruskin University to look at what research has shown over the intervening 11 years, and we are launching their findings today. We hope that you will find today interesting and go on to read the report, which will be available for download from our website, as well as hard copies upon request. As we go through the webinar, I would invite you to use the Q&A function to pose any questions for our panel session at the end, as well as using the chat function to comment, network, connect. I would now like to introduce our chairman, Mr. Alistair Shepherd, OBE. Alistair has been chairman of the Naval Children's Charity since 2017, and has led us through a year of strategic thinking, a name change and rebrand, and an increased purpose for the direction of travel as we look to the future. Alistair was in the Army as a Royal Engineer for 33 years, the majority of that serving abroad with his family. Both children were born in British military hospitals and were educated in service children's schools and then UK boarding schools. His time saw operations in the Falklands, the Balkans, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, and was followed by senior appointments in the MOD, NATO, and the EU. Alistair.
Claire, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody, both across the UK and around the world. We're very pleased that you're going to participate with us this afternoon. A quick thank you to the VFI and Anglia Ruskin, and we're going to hear shortly about a summary of the findings of the research that's been done. This really is a springboard for us to look at how we in our charity can better support children going forward and make sure that we're abreast of all the contemporary challenges that are faced. We also hope that it will provide some guidance and some help for others looking at similar subjects. Our work is important to us, and we hope that it is important to you as well. So I'll hand back to Claire and we'll get on with business. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. I'd now like to play a message from the Second Sea Lord, Vice Admiral Nick Hines, CB, who has written the introduction to the report.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. In 2009, the then Royal Navy and Royal Marine Children's Fund commissioned some groundbreaking research into the effects of service life on children. The key findings from this research, the overlooked casualties of conflict, among other things, led to early day motions in the House of Commons, Ofsted revising their guidelines for all schools, and the service pupil premium being introduced. The landscape 11 years ago was, of course, different, particularly given that it was the height of operations in Afghanistan. But many other things have changed since too. The use of social media, for example, has grown exponentially and is now regularly used by well over half the world's population. And the Royal Navy's tempo of operations has steadily increased in that period too. So it was entirely appropriate that the Naval Children's Charity commissioned some new research earlier this year, looking at what has changed over the intervening 11-year period. Reassuringly, the 10 original key findings from 2009 were reinforced, but some new findings have emerged focused on the needs of today's service children, with some 22 additional recommendations for future research, which will ultimately help identify the resources and support which can be developed and deployed to support the unique need of service parents and children, particularly during periods of separation. I commend the Naval Children's Charity for initiating this pioneering research, which continually strives to put the needs of our children first.
Thank you. I'm now going to introduce Dr. Lorian Gaudier-McBard. She is the Women and Equalities Research Lead at the Veterans and Family Institute for Military Social Research at Anglia Ruskin University and was the primary investigator for the report. She will now take you through an overview of the report and findings. Lauren.
Thanks, Claire. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so today I'm going to take you through the findings of our report, and this really will be a whistle-stop tour through the report, so I'd recommend that you take the opportunity to download the full report following the event if you haven't already, and this will provide you with a lot more detail about the findings. So a bit of background first. In 2009, as has already been said, what was then the Royal Navy and Royal Marines Children's Fund, now known as the Naval Children's Charity, published the Overlooked Casualties of Conflict report. And within that report, which a number of you may be familiar with, this brought together research and expert opinion to highlight the experiences of service children in the UK, really for the first time. And 10 key challenges were identified in this report, ranging from the impact of parental deployment and frequent relocation to parental illness, injury and bereavement as a result of service, and a number of other issues. However, since this report was published, there have been a number of changes to military life, and it's been around 6 years or so since the drawdown from Operation in Afghanistan. And while service personnel are still engaged in a number of overseas operations, these are much less in the public eye in comparison today. Additionally, a number of policy changes have occurred, such as the recent future accommodations model developed by the MOD, giving families more choice in deciding where to live, and the introduction of the service pupil premium in recognition of the specific challenges faced by service children in school, and the introduction of the UK Armed Forces Family Strategy. In addition to this, more personnel are reporting that they have children as compared to a decade ago. So in recognition of these changes, the Naval Children's Charity commissioned us last year to carry out an update and review of the evidence of the impact of service life on children in the UK and how the research landscape has changed in the intervening years. So what did we do? Well, we carried out a systematic scoping review, looking at the available literature, and this included both your peer-reviewed academic papers, but also grey literature, so research reports and inquiries outside of academic journals. We looked primarily at evidence in the UK, but we also looked at culturally aligned countries, particularly those representing the Five Eyes Alliance countries. However, the international literature that we focused on was primarily non-US countries, and the reason for this is the significant cultural differences in both the military and the health and social care structures that exist in the US for military families. However, we do bring that evidence in, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. We also interviewed 12 subject matter experts, and these were ranging from individuals involved in policy to those supporting children directly in health, social care and educational capacities. And this was based on a professional connection to service children and knowledge of the topic area, importantly. So we identified 47 papers and reports from the UK, 15 from other non-US countries, and as you can imagine, hundreds from the US, which we did draw upon to help us to identify consistencies in the evidence base and also gaps in the literature. And our findings are based on a discussion of this evidence base supplemented by our SME interviews. So I just want to highlight quickly, before I move on to the findings, that if you want to access the papers that we identified in this report, you can do so easily through the Veterans and Families Research Hub website. For those who are unaware of it, the Hub is a portal for research and discussion, and it's curated by the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre. bringing together all the research on veterans and families in the UK. And if you go to the address shown here, you can access all the papers that we cited in the report, but more instructions of how to do this are within the full report, so you don't need to worry about remembering this now. Okay, so what did we find? Well, the majority of the challenges identified in the original report still appear to exist, but some aspects of this have changed, and that's what I'm going to try and highlight throughout the findings today. So one of the most significant challenges appears to still be around deployment. Whilst there are significantly fewer service personnel deployed now, overseas operations, peacekeeping, training exercises, humanitarian operations still continue. And that means that service families are still impacted by deployment separation. And according to the literature that we looked at, it's the disruptive and unpredictable nature of deployment in particular that may lead to emotional and psychological difficulties for children. And these are associated with things like worry and concern for their parent, missing their serving parent, and increased difficulties at home caused by that separation. However, findings in this area are a little bit inconsistent, with some studies indicating that deployment isn't related to mental health difficulties, and others pinpointing certain emotional and psychological difficulties, such as anxiety in particular. And these differences are likely due to methodological differences in studies, so looking at different age groups, different service branches, different lengths of deployment, and different ways of measuring children's well-being. One aspect that I'd like to highlight as well is the change in the nature of communication over the past few decades. So where children would have previously been limited to telephone and email contact with their deployed parent, the rise of social media and internet-based communication and technological leaps in that area, instant messaging, video calls, have increased the possibility of regular contact. And our SMEs felt that this brought both benefits and challenges in terms of the potential for increased communication. And this is encapsulated in the quote that I've put on screen. So whilst regular contact may buffer the negative effects of separation, and that is what research suggests, problems with internet connection and difficulties managing the expectations of virtual relationships could cause additional anxiety. And this is an area that really lacks research, but it's something that we're currently examining further, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So it's important to recognise that the impact of separation doesn't end with the return of the service person, and the period following that return has been identified as particularly challenging for military families who will need to readjust to pre-deployment roles and relationships. And research in the UK suggests that young children in particular may experience difficulties in terms of recognising their parents if they're particularly young when they deployed, and may struggle to bond with them when they come back. And this period is also associated with higher levels of family violence and child maltreatment, whilst the overall prevalence of these issues is low in the military. But we were unable to identify any research in the UK looking particularly at the impact on this on children's well-being, but our subject matter experts did suggest that the potential increased levels of family violence following deployment may be associated with a release or coming back from that quite controlled deployment environment, and that's highlighted in the quote that I've put on the screen here. Now, the previous report identified the media as a source of stress for service children when their parent is deployed, and that was mainly associated with seeing images and headlines regarding conflict that their parent might be involved in. And this appears to have become less relevant now, or less cited in research since the drawdown from Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly in terms of the more traditional media, so television and newspapers. However, the rise of social media again, and the increased use of that by children in general, but particularly in service children in this context, may present additional difficulties, including those around communication that we discussed earlier, but also in terms of instant access to information, which may be upsetting, or indeed misinformation regarding the military or operations. However, our subject matter experts also highlighted the potential for social media to increase connectivity with the military community and perhaps give children the opportunity to connect with other service children, particularly those who are mobile and may have left friends behind. Another important change in the past decade concerns the rise in the number of dispersed military families, or families living away from the military base or unit. And alongside this, we've seen a rise in what is often termed weekending, in which the serving person is away from their family during the week or their family home and returns at the weekend. And evidence suggests that this can bring a number of benefits, including stability for service children, but also challenges such as distance from the military community or military support services, particularly those on base. The limited family time as well, and last minute changes that sometimes occur to hours, is also viewed by some in some research that we identified as being more difficult to manage sometimes than operational deployments. Additionally, some negative impacts on children's mental health and well-being associated with weekending have been reported in the UK. And despite the increase in weekending, the impact of relocation remains a challenge for those who experience it, as children may be required to move many times to many different schools, so leaving friends and potentially family behind. And there are a number of practical issues associated with this as well, and that forms quite a big part of the report, including getting schools midway through terms, or getting school places, missing or repeating parts of the curriculum, and the transfer of educational records. And these are difficulties associated with differing educational policies and curriculum in different areas as well and across the devolved nations. And SMEs also commented that service children sometimes report lacking what our SMEs termed geographical roots as a result of frequent relocation, which is highlighted again in the quote on screen there. And this is related to children's sense of identity and sense of belonging. Evidence in terms of the impact of mobility, frequent relocation on children's well-being and attainment, educational attainment, is quite inconsistent. It's clear that leaving friends behind is very difficult for service children, but some studies highlight the positive impact of this on things like adaptability and resilience. When looking at educational attainment in particular, this is quite inconsistent, and some studies find poorer and some better achievement in service children compared to civilian children. However, mobility does seem to be key here in terms of impacting attainment. And some of the differences, again, may be due to things like methodological differences in the characteristics of the service children included, but also the methods of measuring attainment as well could potentially be different. Moving on a little bit, the previous report highlights the impact of injury, illness and bereavement on service children, but we were unable to find a lot of research in terms of this. We found no research really that looked particularly at the impact of physical injury on children, although there is some on the wider kind of family unit, and we found mixed evidence regarding the impact of parental mental health on children. Some of these kind of limited evidence base may be due to the fact that there are fewer service personnel experiencing service-related injury and illness now compared to when the previous report was published, and there's been a significant reduction in the number of in-service deaths that are reported. There has been an increase in male service personnel suicides, but I would emphasise the fact that this is still lower than that seen in the general population. And similarly, no UK research is focused on the impact of parental bereavement or suicide on service children. We do have research from the US that suggests that the impact of this on service children has a lot to do with the consistency and functioning of the family before and after bereavement, and this is key. And the importance of support from the military community is also highlighted, including formal military-specific bereavement services, but also informal support from the wider military community. And this was confirmed by our subject matter experts who also felt that service children should receive tailored support following this. So there were certain what I've termed here as vulnerable groups of service children also identified in the UK literature. And as highlighted in the previous reports, there are challenges faced by children with special educational needs and disability. However, estimates of how many service children have SEND vary significantly in the UK literature, with reports of, I think, between kind of 6 and 25% reported, again, depending on the methodology and the study. Mobility in particular can create difficulties for service children with SEND, particularly with the transfer of educational records and statements of need across region and across the devolved nations. Children with SEND often have to be reassessed with each move, and there's currently no standard approach across different regions in the devolved nations for doing this. And some of the evidence suggests that in some cases, service children could still be waiting for their child to, service families, sorry, could still be waiting for their child to be reassessed when they're posted to a new location, as indicated by the quote on screen. And this will inevitably impact on the continuity of support for these children, although again, there's very little research looking at the impact of that. Some children may also have to take on additional caring responsibilities when the serving parent is away, caring potentially for the remaining parent or siblings who may be affected by illness or disability, or may have to help care for an injured serving or ex-serving parent. And recent research in the UK suggests that military young carers may be particularly vulnerable to the adverse impact of caring, as this can be compounded by some of the other challenges that are associated with military life, so things like mobility again. However, we have, again, very limited statistics regarding the number of young carers in the military community. And our SMEs actually highlighted the potential difficulties in capturing this, particularly in terms of those who are carrying out temporary or intermittent caring, such as those who take on extra caring responsibilities when their serving parent is deployed. And actually, these children may not recognise themselves as young carers, making it even more difficult to identify them. Something that I was keen to highlight today and in the report, amongst the challenges are the positives of service life that service children report. And a key theme that we identified in the evidence base and from our SMEs related to children's sense of pride in their parents' service. And a number of other positives are reported as well, including job security, being part of that military community, seeing new places, meeting new people, having positive role models, and learning the kind of military work ethic. Resilience was an interesting one, and this split our SME interviewees in terms of their kind of perspective on it. Some UK research highlights this kind of adaptability, coping skills and independence gained by service children as a result of service life, and some of our SMEs did agree with this. However, there were other SMEs who were sceptical about this and had concerns that this is sometimes used as an excuse not to deal with the challenges that service children face. And other SMEs felt that this was completely dependent on the individual child rather than them being a service child. So where is the UK evidence base still lacking? Well, we make 27 recommendations in the report, and the majority of these highlight the need to fill significant gaps that still exist in the evidence base. And I'm not going to go through all of these today, but I want to highlight a couple of key issues. We still have very limited reliable data on service children, and this would really help us to identify need better in terms of where they are, and also what aspects of life they may need more support for. And there also remain a number of understudied groups, which I talked about a bit already, in which the current evidence base suggests there may be increased needs or unique needs. And this includes children with SEND and young carers, but also children who are part of single parent and dual serving families. And I haven't had time to go over that today, but these are shown within the evidence base to face additional challenges associated with military life, particularly around deployments and childcare. And future research should also look to focus on the voices and perspectives of service children themselves. And this is really crucial because over half of the UK papers that we identified didn't do that. They didn't speak to service children. They instead spoke to service personnel, spouses and partners and other stakeholders, practitioners, teachers, as a proxy for understanding the challenges faced by children. And lastly, there appears to be a significant lack of evaluated support models for service children in the UK and a general lack of awareness of the needs of service children. So it will be important going forward to ensure that support for service children is evidence-based and provided by professionals who understand the military culture and service children's unique needs. So what can we conclude? Well, we've seen a steady increase in research with 54 papers identified post 2010. What we can deduce from the evidence base is that most of the challenges that were identified in the Overlooked Casualties of Conflict report in 2009 still exist. And there are still gaps in terms of educational and health and social care support for service children, with difficulties particularly around moving between regions and the devolved nations and the different policies that exist there. There's also still a lack of reliable data on service children and gaps in the evidence base in terms of our understanding of their support needs. And as I said, based on that, we've made 27 recommendations that require more attention. In particular, new challenges since 2009 include things like leaps in technology on communication during separation, the rise of weekending and dispersal, and it's become apparent there is a lack of kind of evidence-based support models for service children in the literature anyway. And filling these gaps in knowledge will be necessary in order to provide service children with a level playing field, and indeed to meet the commitments made to service families in the Armed Forces Covenant. So lastly today, I just want to highlight an area that we're already taking forward with the Naval Children's Charity, and that's a study looking at these changes in communication related to internet-based technology and social media, and how that impacts on communication during separation and service children's well-being. So we're looking for naval children aged between 11 and 18 years. We're also looking for naval spouses and recent naval service leavers, so those who've left in the past 12 months, to take part in interviews and focus groups for this study. So if you or anyone you know want to take part in this, or you're able to share it with your networks, you can find more information about this on the NCC's website, but also by contacting me if you want to, using the email address on screen there. So please do feel free to share this and get in touch if you're interested in taking part. So thank you for listening. Please feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A box if you haven't already, for the panel discussion. So I'll just stop sharing and hand back over to Claire.
Thank you, Lauren. And thank you all who've put questions already in the Q&A and comment in the chat. We're now going to have a 25-minute or so question and answer session. Our panel today consists of Lauren, who you've just heard from, Alistair Shepherd, our chairman, who you met earlier, and then we have Associate Professor Matt Fossey, who is the Director of the Veterans and Families Institute for Military Social Research at Anglia Ruskin University. We also have Colonel Clive Knightley. He enlisted into the Royal Artillery in 1976 and saw operational service at regimental duty and on the staff in Northern Ireland, the Gulf, Sierra Leone, Iraq and Afghanistan until his retirement from the regular army in 2012. Since 2012, he has served as a full-time reservist, responsible for the Ministry of Defence's policies and plans affecting service children and young people. As a service parent, he has personal experience of the challenges explored by this report. His son celebrated his first birthday in the fourth and second country he had lived in, and celebrated his second and third birthdays without his father due to operational deployments. Russell Collier joined the Ministry of Defence in 2016 and leads the global education team in Armed Forces, Families and Safeguarding. His team worked closely with a wide variety of stakeholders, including the DfE, local authorities and family federations, advocating for service children on their educational pathway. Prior to joining the MOD, he was a teacher for 20 years in both the state and independent sector, with roles including head teacher of a 3 to 18 independent school. Ellen Rees-White joined the Naval Children's Charity as a trustee in 2019 and is our first trustee who is a former beneficiary of the charity. She has led us through a rebrand and marketing strategy in her first year with us, drawing on her skills working at the Volkswagen Group. And she also brings her personal experience as a beneficiary to our welfare committee. Thank you all for joining us. So we have some questions in the Q&A, and I see some more have just gone in there. So if I could start with one of the questions, which is quite an easy one, Lauren, I'll pass to you. Is this a Navy children only report, and how many children were interviewed?
So this report was a review of the evidence in terms of all service branches across the armed forces. So we didn't limit it to naval children at all, but in terms of how many children were interviewed, this wasn't primary data collection. So it would be the number of children that were interviewed across all the different studies that we looked at. So I couldn't say, but yeah, this is military wide in terms of what we were looking at.
And there was also a comment on why in the first part of your presentation, you highlighted that the increase in service families with children has gone from 48 to 79% in FAMCAS 2020. I think the question has been answered in Q&A, but from what I can see, it really was down to data collection. And from about 2015, the numbers of children has remained fairly standard at that same level. So around about 77, 79%.
Yeah, and I think in the report, we talk a little bit more about the numbers of service children and the estimates of that. And it does appear to have remained fairly stable, at least over the last few years, really.
We were also asked, given the study was service-wide, was there any attempt to separate the RNRM from the Army and RAF?
So there are a few kind of issues that do impact the Navy a little bit more than the other services. In terms of separating it, it's quite difficult because some studies only look at certain service branches and some look at all of them. And now the ones that look at all of them don't tend to split out. So it's quite difficult to do that comparison at the moment. The issues that we know or that we think impact naval families a little more are things like separation. So naval families report being separated in terms of both deployment, but also in terms of the dispersal and weekending, more so than the other two services, whereas they seem to be, they do report less mobility. So that is just clear from the kind of FAMCAS and AFCAS surveys, but in terms of the actual impact on service children, it's really difficult to pull out those difficulties in terms of the evidence base that we have.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Alistair now, just briefly. It's a question not from the questions here, but as a trustee, so Alistair and Ellen, can you just elaborate a little bit on the plans that the Naval Children's Charity have based on the report's findings?
Yes, Claire, thanks very much indeed. Well, of course, the findings cover a very broad range of issues that can impact upon service children. As a Naval Children's Charity, we're clearly going to focus on Navy children, those who come from serving families and those whose parents or have retired or left the service. Our real focus should be on, as a charity, the education, health and well-being of the children that we support. So we're looking at that, and I think we need to do some more research. The trustees so far have been kept abreast of the findings of the research, and I'll hand back to Ellen in a minute just to elaborate on something that Lauren has already touched upon, where we might go in terms of further research. But I think there are a number of areas where we can concentrate, perhaps advocacy, discussions and further examination. There's still a lot to do about the education side of life and making sure that we can overcome the challenges faced by children who are travelling throughout the UK. but also it's becoming more evident that those children with special education, disability, health needs are actually having some real challenges in terms of gaining the necessary support from the different national, local, regional authorities that may be able to support them. So there's a large number of areas that we can look at, but there's one particular area that we'd like to focus on. Over to Ellen.
Yes, thank you, Alistair. And I think just to elaborate on Claire's point right at the start, a big thing that we've been working on in the last year is all around how we can communicate and reach more of our beneficiaries online and build on that online presence as the Naval Children's Charity. And for that reason, we've been working on our rebrand and also, making sure our presence is there across lots of different social media channels and online in general. And I think the report really highlights that in terms of social media. We have almost a responsibility really to educate and keep people in the loop of what's important for them as Naval children and for their families, and to make sure we miss out any of that misinformation they might be seeing online, and making sure that we can educate them on the latest in our industry. So one thing we're really going to build upon is social media being a real big focus, ensuring that we're reaching those beneficiaries, we're providing them with reliable and trustworthy information, and making them feel part of the Naval Children's Charity and everything that we can offer to them as well. So a lot more research is going to go into that over the next few months.
Thank you. Clive and Russell, can I just bring you in here just as representatives of Armed Forces Families and Safeguarding? Could you comment on what findings and recommendations stood out most to you? Clive, shall I go to you first?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I think it sounds a bit of a trite answer, but I think the biggest takeaway for us is just the volume of material that's out there. And I say that in the context that, and Defence is no different to any other organisation, we've got limited resources available that we can use to make sure that our families and their children are looked after. And clearly, even when we've got willing partners in the third sector who can assist us with that funding and resourcing challenge, we absolutely have to make sure that we are channeling those resources to where there is a real need and where that need can be met with the biggest return on that investment. And Lauren highlighted the number of sources of other data that were sort of looked at in the literature review for this work. And our biggest challenge has been to filter out, if you like, the wheat from the chaff from that. So it's slightly self-serving of me because the way that the MOD has organised itself, and I should highlight as well that the other thing that's occurred since this report was first written in 2009 was that the MOD actually created a dedicated directorate looking after children and young people issues. Hitherto, there hadn't been that defence level focus. It had been looked after by one of the armed forces services as the lead service on behalf of the others. And it would be fair to say that the MOD hadn't truly appreciated the duties that were laid on it, either explicitly or implicitly by the Children Acts, particularly the Children Act of 04. So the creation of the then Directorate of Children and Young People, creating defence level and subordinate children boards across where the military footprint existed, particularly overseas, really energising the safeguarding piece as that wraparound to all that we do. Was really a significant change, and I think for the people who went before me, I think that needs to be acknowledged. And I stress that because we've just reorganised again, because most of you will be familiar with the military's desire to occasionally reorganise and ostensibly to try and do things better. And in this case, we absolutely are, because the group that I work with and work with within DCYP looking at policies and plans has now moved into the heart of the Chief of Defence People's area, where we will get much more leverage and much more direct contact with the other stakeholders, both within the MOD, but it will also allow us to do even better engagement with other government departments, with the devolved administrations, with the third sector and elsewhere. And a key part of the area that falls under me within the new Armed Forces Families and Safeguarding team is a dedicated team focusing on, from an MOD perspective, looking at the research that's currently out there and doing that analysis to work out where there are gaps, trying to correlate it with other evidence that we've got from our own subject matter experts, many of whom will have been in the group of 24 that Lauren dealt with for this particular paper, and making sure that we highlight and identify the research that gives us something really important that we can change, and that we can then start the process of doing that. But equally importantly, again, as Lauren highlighted, identifying where there are gaps in our current understanding, or where we have doubts or concerns about the research that's been done, or whether the research didn't quite deliver. It's interesting, I was involved in a piece of research undertaken by the Children's Society on young carers in military families. And that was a deeply challenging piece of work to distill into hard recommendations for some of the reasons that Lauren highlighted. So I think the key takeaway for me is a much more general one, which is this just highlights how much research is out there and the challenge of making sure that we identify which are the really valid pieces of research that we can draw lessons from, and those gaps. And I saw that one of the questions referred to the recent report, Living in Our Shoes, by Andrew Selou, MP. We've had that report now since it was launched back in January, I think, and had visibility of it before. And essentially that's allowed us to reassuringly identify a lot of areas that in our existing children and families plans we were already delivering against. We may need to change the focus slightly, but also confirms where there might have been a gap in our understanding and therefore a gap in our planning to deliver something. So I think it's that gap analysis piece which springs off the report in my eyes. Sorry, that's a very long answer for a very short one.
Oh, thank you, Clive. Russell, do you want to add anything to that?
Thanks, Claire. I won't add a great deal, because obviously we want to get through as many questions as we possibly can. But for me, again, from an educational perspective, there are some key areas that Lauren's mentioned around school admissions and SEN support, which we are heavily involved with at the moment, and we'll be more than happy at another time to talk about the work we're doing in those areas.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think that also ties into one of the questions around SEND. Matt, you have your hand up. Did you want to quickly add something?
Yeah, if I may. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, just a very quick one, really, and it's about a comment that Lauren made during her presentation, and that's about the breadth of the research that's out there and available. And just, I suppose it's for people watching, really, just to be mindful of the fact that there is an awful lot of research that's undertaken in the States. And what we've found, I think, historically, is people have tend to lean on the findings of this research quite heavily when they're thinking about making changes in service provision or thinking about changes to our policies, etc. And it's a bit of a health warning, really, in that the situation in America, particularly culturally, and the service provision situation is so different from the UK that in a way it's sort of it's not right to actually try to translate the findings of that US research and try to apply it in the UK. And you know, it's probably a truism to say that the US military research budget is bigger than our defence budget. So they've got lots of money floating around to do research. You know, and we traditionally haven't in the UK, really. It's only in the last sort of 20 years or so that we've really sort of ramped up some of the activity around military research. And, you know, and there is still a big paucity that Lauren's identified in the report as well, around research to do with military children and families. So it's a big call, really, for research funders and for academics out there listening to this, maybe, who have good ideas, to say, yeah, more research is required. So go for it. Over.
And I think that ties in with quite a lot of the questions we're seeing. I think both the Salou report and a lot of the other, somebody's mentioned the SCIS report, the fantastic work the RCET does in Scotland. You know, there's some fantastic research out there, but I think in many ways, like all research, it's showing us what we don't know and that there's more to be found out. And I think the more that we can look into these areas to enhance the lives of our children is incredibly important. Obviously, our focus is naval children, that is our remit, but we are delighted that this report covers all military children. And I think if we just spark some interest in what other research is available or should be done, then that would be fantastic. I'm just going to go through a few of the other questions. So we have a question on, there's a widespread view that the suicide rate for ex-service is higher than the wider population, but Lauren, in your report, you actually said the opposite. Is that, would you like to expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm aware, in terms of the research that we've looked at, it is lower in service personnel than it is in the civilian population. I think that there are differences when you look specifically at different age groups. I couldn't tell you what those are off the top of my head, but that kind of widespread suggestion that there is a higher level, it doesn't play out when you look at the statistics.
And that's also holds true actually for bereavement in general, certainly for bereaved children. The incidence of bereaved children in the civilian population is around parallel with the incidence of bereaved children in the serving population. But obviously sometimes that bereavement is linked to their job, and I think that's an added stressor there. A question about the effect on the serving female parent in terms of greater time deployed. I don't know if anything was thrown up on the research there.
No, that's a really good point, and it's something that we have mentioned throughout the report, is that there is a real lack of research that looks at the serving parent being the mother. And a lot of the research, particularly around things like the impact of serving parents' mental health on children, it's just looking at paternal mental health. It's not including women. And I think that, you know, generally in military and veteran research, you know, because women are a minority, there has been historically a tendency to not specifically pull out the issues that might be unique to the serving female or parent in this instance. But yeah, I know that there was very little to nothing that we could pull out specifically about female serving mothers.
And it's something that was highlighted to us at the charity over the last few years. We produced a book for younger children where parents going away, and the book talked about daddy going away. And in response to some of the, you know, the response we got to that, we very much took that on board, and we've just produced one last year, which is for where a mother goes away. So, you know, we understand that now more and more serving mothers are deployed or going away. So it is an issue. Yeah. Looking again, Lauren, could you say a bit more on why support from the military community is difficult to access, and accepting that more work on social media is planned? What is the sense regarding whether intra-children social media connectivity is a positive or negative influence?
So there was two parts to that question. I think the first one was around why military support was difficult to access. Is that right? So I think the main area where we came across this was in terms of dispersal. I can't think where we came across that in any other terms, and that was just simply because the, you know, dispersed families are often quite far away from military bases, so they were less able to access military support in terms of the kind of military community and, you know, welfare services on base. So the second part of the question was around challenges and benefits to social media. Is that right? Yeah. So the benefits that, and again, there's little research. There are a few reports that mention this, but a lot of what we found was either from SME SMEs talking about this, and also from a few papers from the US. But the benefits are, of course, around the potential for increased contact, and that being, potentially instant, whereas, historically it would have been much less regular. But the challenges in terms of that were around managing expectations to a certain extent. So we had some SMEs talking about how, of course, you may have the expectation of speaking to someone on FaceTime or something like that, and then the internet connection not working. So that's one aspect of it. The other kind of aspect in terms of managing expectations and managing kind of family relationships more generally was in terms of what you decide to actually disclose between you. And, to give a kind of example of that, it was around sharing, your day-to-day difficulties in life that perhaps, you would have solved before speaking to your serving parent previously. If you only spoke to them once a week, minor issues at home may have been resolved by the time you actually speak to them, whereas something that's quite stressful for the child could be shared with the parent, who's then unable to really help with that at all because they may be in a completely different country or on a ship or something like that. So they were the main kind of benefits and challenges. But again, there's little research in this, so we really need to look at it in more depth, which we are doing.
We've got a question here about, and it's a really key one actually, about data, because I think one of the things that we really found from this report is data is so important. The question about the number of children actually of service families, and we're always striving to get more data. Can I throw that back out possibly to Clive or Russell? What the definition of a service child and service family, especially considering the diversity of modern family types? So how can we mitigate the risk of service children being excluded from much needed support by virtue of policy definitions? And I think it comes back to how do we capture that information as well?
No, it's a very valid point from Phil Dent, as I would have expected. No, the MOD has been grappling for a while now with what it rather unhelpfully calls eligibility and entitlement. And within the children and young people area, we have always tried to generate a definition of the service child that is as fair a one as we can find, to make sure that we're providing support to that child. And some of the changes that have occurred in terms of long-term partners and that level of family recognition has clearly been in a good step forward, and it's helped us because it's made it quite clear where we actually have a responsibility to provide information, advice, guidance and support to those service parents with service children that we need to be supporting. The wider data challenge, though, shouldn't be underestimated, where the MOD has a direct responsibility, and of course in overseas locations where we are acting or filling the vacuum of the lack of a local authority and the level of service that would normally be found within a local authority within England or the devolved administrations, then our data is fairly good because we don't allow families to deploy overseas without clearing them, without recording them and registering them and so on. It's more challenging in the UK, in the four home countries, where at the moment, and we're tightening up on this, we don't cleanse the data as much as we would like, and we still don't have a mandatory requirement placed on our service families to declare and probably more importantly keep up to date the details of their dependent children, going back to definitions again, that we can draw from the MOD's personnel management information system to give us that rough figure. That said, we're not working in a complete vacuum. We have reasonable figures. Funny enough, we draw some general comparisons with the detail on FAMCAS, as mentioned earlier. And we also tap into other resources within the Westminster government and the devolved administrations. We talked about or mentioned the service pupil premium. That provides some useful information, although it also includes children of serving parents who are no longer serving. But we do have a reasonable handle on the figures, but it is compounded, as the question has posed, where we're not sure, are we talking about just those of serving personnel, those who are just transitioned into civilian life from a military career, or actually people who've been away from the military for some time. And although we've talked about recognised partnerships, long-term partnerships from an MOD perspective, how far do you take the wider definition of the family? It is a constant challenge, and one that we are trying to address as best we can.
Thank you, Clive. I am conscious that we are fast approaching 2 o'clock and we're not going to get to every question, so I apologize for that. One of the things was about the link not working, so I think Abby is going to make sure that we get the link correctly in the chat for you, and you can also contact us and we can send the link out to you. But if you just go to the Naval Children's Charity website, you will find it there in the research section. It is now live for downloading. And if you would like a hard copy, please let us know. Just contact us, send us an email, and we can do that for you. I think one of the questions at the end here, I think ties in quite nicely. So Ellen, I'm going to come to you as a sort of final bit about that. It talks about, is there room for young people becoming cultural ambassadors and showing positive experiences? You took your experience as a service child and as a beneficiary needing the support of the charity, and you've become one of our greatest ambassadors and now a trustee. So could I just ask how this report resonated with you and how you feel going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my side, I grew up as a naval child, and you know, it's taken me to turn 26 and reading that report to actually see what I've been through as a child, and really for it to resonate with me. I think you just get on with it as a naval child, and you don't really see that you're treated differently or you're going through any different challenges to anyone else, really. So I think that was the biggest thing for me, was just to read that and relate to those experiences, especially around mobility. I think I counted that before I turned 16, I'd moved 10 times, 10 different houses, internationally, different locations, and that was just the norm for me. So yeah, a lot of that report definitely resonated with me, and I think the biggest thing that I want us to be able to achieve as a charity is just reaching out to more children and being able to communicate with them. So we definitely have an ambassador program that we're setting up. So we're looking for naval children that can come and represent us and talk about their experiences and try and relate to more children and kind of reach and communicate and have someone for others to relate to. So we've now set up, and Claire's launched the ambassador program, and we've had a couple of people already interested to work with us. So that's a very exciting project where they'll come and do talks with us and represent us, which is very exciting. We also want to do set up an alumni community. So we've got people that have been beneficiaries, whether that's children, families, that can kind of all be able to share their experiences that way. And then, as I said before, and I think it answers another question around how we're going to be able to communicate and reach children with this report. And a big thing for us is we want to be able to break this into really simple, easy chunks of information so that young people can relate to it. And, you know, they don't have to read the in-depth of the report. It can relate to younger people of all ages, so they really understand, you know, what they're going through, and we can support them that way. So lots of ideas and activities that we're working on to reach more young people and share this information and educate with them.
Thank you. And I think that is the positive message, really, that this piece of research ties in with all the research that supports service families, supports our children, tri-service, obviously focused on naval children for us, but we, you know, for all military children, we just look to the future to how we can all work together with MOD, with the services, both in the serving and the veteran population, to give them a positive future. Thank you all for attending. We'll leave the chat open for a few minutes if you want to continue to put anything in there, and please do get in touch if you want a hard copy of the report, or if you've got any further comments or questions, please just come to us and we will do our best to answer them. But thank you all, and thank you panel for your input. I think we could have gone on for quite a lot longer, but there we go. As is always the way, we are up on time. Thank you and goodbye.